funktioniert Dankeschön. Super. All right, perfect. I think this should work now. Can you hear me all right? Also the ladies in the back? Wonderful. So welcome then to the second session of Introduction to the Study of Language 2. We started out with morphology, you know that, and today we'll have our second session on morphology before we move on to semantics and syntax later on. So today will be mostly a review from last time. We'll start out with allomorphy because I feel that maybe didn't get quite enough attention. Then we'll quickly look back at different types of morpheme. And then we'll go into more details when it comes to inflection and derivation. And last but not least, we'll look at word formation. So just to wrap that up, you remember allomorphs, that's parallel to what we said an allophone is, right? So if we say a phoneme, that's the abstract bits, the abstract sort of sound categories, then we have different physical realizations, like these ones. Let's see if that works.
Beaten, brittle, turtle, understand.
Yeah, so what's the difference between those four? Between beaten, brittle, turtle, and understand? Perfect. Thank you. They don't all sound the same, but they're different realizations of the same thing. And they are different because of what? Sort of what makes one appear and sometimes another one appear? How are they conditioned? Right? We'd say they're phonologically conditioned, right? Because when do I have beaten, when do I have this stop, and when do I have turtle, where I have this aspiration, when do I have understand, where I don't have that, when do I do the flap brittle? What's the difference there? Well, it's got to do with the sounds, right? So whatever other sounds are around them, between two vowels, or at the beginning, or somewhere else, that's what matters. So we say they're phonologically conditioned. And this is something we can have for morphemes and morphs as well, right? So the phoneme is the abstract thing, and the morpheme is also the abstract representation in your head, sort of. Like we talked last time about the P's, that we don't define them in any way, but we have sort of an image that we connect to a sound unit, and that's my lexeme. And that's also what the morpheme is here. So that's the smallest meaningful unit, but then we also have a morph. That's the actual physical realization of it, right? So we have the cats and the frogs and the horses, which are also phonologically conditioned, right? Because I have the sound if I have an unvoiced sound, z after voice, and horses after sibilants. So after all kinds of s and sh and these tischlaute, right? So this is one kind of conditioning I can have for allomorphy. But I can also have other ones for morphemes. Like, and again, our morpheme, our meaning unit is plural. But we have different realizations. What's the difference between mice and mouses? Nah? Any computer people to the rescue? When do we talk about mice and when do we talk about mouses? Right? So the rodents on top are certainly mice. Now, you can call a computer mouse in plural mouses, mice, but you can also say mouses, right? The difference between being what kind of lexical item I actually have. So remember, despite the fact that these are spelled the same, so they're homographs, they're pronounced the same, so they're homonyms, they're nevertheless two different lexemes, and therefore two different morphs here, right? Morphemes here. Because you have a different representation for each word. So those are then lexically conditioned, but we said we have a third type, which we have in this example.
Finite.
Infinite.
So we've got finite and we've got infinite. Different pronunciation. How are they conditioned? What's the difference between those? So we said we have phonologically conditioned, lexically conditioned. And what happens with the third one? What happens if I add in to the word finite? What do I add? Well, in doesn't really add grammatical meaning. What kind of meaning does it add? Lexical meaning. It's a negation. Yes, both of you are completely right. So we have this morpheme, sort of this finiteness, and then we have a second one, right? The negation of it. So that's then, morphologically conditioned, right? So three kinds of conditioning that we talked about: phonologically, lexically, and morphologically, because here we have a second morpheme that changes the morpheme finite to finite. Any questions about allomorphy? All right, then we'll move on to the different types we talked about last time. So we said there are three parameters that we use, three categories that we use to categorize morphemes. Who can remember the three categories? Just shout them out. Free versus bound. Yes, what do we call the category? Autonomy. Perfect. So we said autonomy, whether or not they're free or bound. What else did we have? What other categories? The function. Perfect. Yes. The function, and then last but not least, yes, beautiful. Position, where they actually are. And you correctly said autonomy is a question of free or bound. So the free ones we call lexemes, and the bound ones are the affixes. What two functions did we identify last time? And I already heard that here with the hypotheses about what in and infinite does. What are the two functions morphemes can fulfill? Beautiful, thank you. Lexical and grammatical. Now, if it's a free lexical, that's different from a free grammatical, right? What are our free lexical items? Our free lexical morphemes. Yes? Yes, beautiful. The content words. And the grammatical ones? Wonderful. Content words and function words. So sort of the open class of words and the closed class, right? And then how about the bound ones? What do we call lexical bound ones? What do they do to a word? Well, we said they sort of create a new word, right? And if they create a new word, we sort of derive a new word. So those are the derivational affixes. Whereas if we just add grammatical meaning, we say that's a question of inflection, so inflectional affixes. And then last but not least, for position, for derivational affixes, we can have two positions, namely, beautiful, prefix and suffix. Whereas for inflectional ones, we only have suffixes, right? Okay, now that we've brought that back, let's look at these words or phrases, and please, together with your neighbors, split them up. Which ones are content words, function words, derivational prefixes, derivational suffixes, and inflectional suffixes? Have a go at this, please. All right, who would like more time? Or are we more or less done? Yes, sure. Okay, let's see then. What are the content words? Just shout them. Quick, yes. What else? Help, indeed. Have, yes. Which one, though? Is it indeed both of them? They're both verbs, yeah, but are they both full verbs? This one is really a helping verb, right? An auxiliary verb. So what's an auxiliary verb then? Where does it go? It's a function word, yes. So only this have, only the first, the second one, and then of course child, right? So our function words then are this, yes. Could, indeed. A and, as we just said, have. Yep. Then we've got derivational affixes. So remember, derivational are the ones that derive a new lexeme for us. They don't change the grammatical meaning, but they actually change the meaning of the word. So which ones do that? Which ones are derivational prefixes? Yeah, the prefixes, just an, and then the suffix, indeed, li, which leaves us with our two inflectional suffixes, in and id. Any questions about this? Perfect, and we've done your studying for you already. This is it, sort of. And today, we'll talk about derivational and inflectional a bit more, and then, as I said, about word formation. So again, just a reminder, lexical are the open class. We can easily add to them. We constantly make up new words. We borrow words from other languages. Whereas with grammatical ones, we have sort of our set, and we tend to not make up new ones, which sort of makes sense, because if I have a and the, what other category could I possibly come up with? Or if I have my numbers from 1 to infinity, I don't suddenly come up with a number that is somewhere in between, right? Although that is not 100% true. Like when you look at the pronouns, in one way it makes sense. We have I, you, he, she, it, we, you, they, and we don't usually feel the need to make up, for example, a dual, which exists in other languages, which has to do with two people. There's another pronoun specifically for two people. English doesn't have that, but we do have this ambiguity, right, between you and you. If I say, could you stand up, you wouldn't know if I just mean one of you or many. But if I said, you all, then obviously I mean all of you. And we get that especially in US American English, and just to give you a brief look at what that looks like, pay attention to the pronouns.
Hi there. Where y'all from? LA. Come on. International crowd. It's fine.
Right? You all heard her say it, right? So she said, y'all, and this sort of you all that has almost merged into one word, and especially in informal spelling is often written as one word, in the south of the USA has become a sort of new pronoun. So that basically is adding to the closed class. And you can actually have all y'all, because you all, y'all has not really, doesn't really have this meaning of you all anymore, but just plural. So you have, could all y'all stand up now? And then I mean all, really all of you. You've got something like that in Scottish as well, right? Does anyone watch Shetland or something like that? They've got yous. Yeah. Which I'm not going to pretend I can do a Scottish accent, so please imagine or watch Shetland. So you have yous. And that means we sort of sometimes do add to the closed class, but it's definitely the exception to the rule, whereas lexical items, and we'll talk in great detail about this today, we add to like there's no tomorrow. And we have this difference between grammatical and lexical in terms of affixes as well. So the ones that make new words, we said, are derivational. We derive a new word. And different languages have different ways of doing that, but we all do it. Yeah, English and German, just to give you some examples to look at and make sure, yes, I understand what the difference between a derivational and an inflectional affix is. The interesting thing is that English, of course, has very little inflectional affixes anymore. So if you look at languages like Russian, where every case for a noun has its own way to be marked, we don't really have that in English anymore, right? No matter if I have house as the nominal, or as the accusative, or as the dative, or if I use a house to do something, if I have an instrumental, it's always house. But we do have some inflection, right? We still have the genitive. We still have Stevens, for example. Whereas if I look at Mandarin, it's basically always the same. Which, if you think of it a little bit, makes sense because you have these characters, and if you started adding little squiggles to them for inflection, you'll probably go crazy, which you do anyway if you learn it. But basically, so this would be the character for book, which is shu, and it's shu in whatever case, whether the book is doing something or I'm doing something to the book, I'm using the book, it's always shu. And there is not really an inflection for possessive or genitive either. So in Mandarin, you always have to say the page of the book. You cannot say the book's page. So there's no inflection for that. And one such set in grammar terms sort of is called a paradigm. One set from first case to however many cases you have. And in English, there's no difference between the different elements within the paradigm, whereas in many other languages, including German, but most obviously here Russian, we do have that. And the same goes for conjugation, right? We still have I go, he goes, but not much more in English, except for the form to be. German has quite a bit, ich gehe, du gehst, er geht, and so on and so forth. And once again, Mandarin has nothing. It's 我去, 你去. It's always 去, to go, for example. So we can see that there's a decline of languages, some which don't have any inflection. Do you remember what we call those from ISL 1? Yeah. And the, no? Where there's no, exactly, yes. And then on the other hand, we have strongly inflectional ones. Some of them have this sort of together, and some of them have them stacked together. These are the agglutinating. And if you have really nothing, then they're isolating, so you don't see anything around them. Yeah, but English didn't always behave that way, right? I take it some of you are taking history of English right now. So you've probably learned about that in Old English we had full inflection, which gradually disappeared, and today we have very little that's expressed anymore. But sometimes it still matters what it was like. So you know that with German we have different nouns, and depending what kind of noun it is, it behaves differently. Also for verbs, or I mean, I don't know, if you've learned Spanish at school, you have the verbs that end in ar, and those that end in er, and those that end in ir, and they conjugate differently, right? So they're different classes. And English has lost it all, but it used to have it, and sometimes that still plays tricks with us. So this is about all the inflection English still has. And the difference being, just to sum that up once more, if it's inflection, then it's grammatical information. If we talk about derivation, then we change meaning, then we change the lexeme in and of itself, creating a new one. And derivation often changes word class. It doesn't have to, but it can. And the relationship is not completely stable. So there's a certain kind of variation going on with one prefix or suffix being able to do numerous things, and more or less one meaning, which can also be expressed by numerous different prefixes and suffixes. And they can attach to a subset of possible bases often. So sometimes they can only go with adjectives, or they can only go with nouns, right? Whereas inflection never changes word class. The form and meaning relationship is stable. So if I add ed, then that's it. That's past or being over in some way or another. And they attach to all possible bases, right? So usually if I have, I mean, the morpheme, of course, we're talking about. Sort of if I have this sort of idea of plural that goes with all kinds of nouns. And in English, that's only suffixes. We don't have grammatical prefixes. Okay. So far, this has been fairly straightforward, I think, because English is straightforward when it comes to inflection and derivation at the first glance. But I'd like you to sort of delve into this a little bit. This is a picture of a bit more complexity. So I've given you a number of words here, all of which have prefixes in this case. Some of them also have suffixes. And I'd like you to try to sort of categorize them in terms of their prefixes a little bit. So have a look at them and see what kind of categories can you apply. I'm going to give you 5 minutes for that because it's quite a number of words. How would you split them up, basically? Chat to your neighbors. It's usually more fun with other people. So if you were researchers and this was a language completely foreign to you and you sort of had to sort of wrap your head around this morphology that this language has, what would be the most obvious thing to categorize these by? What would you probably start with? Oh, that's already very deep into it, but definitely true, absolutely. Let's be more childish. What is the first thing we see? Yeah. There are different prefixes, yes. So we have words with a and with one with anti, then with I and we have u, right? And then of course we have different words in there, right? Some of the other bits, the not prefixes or bases, repeat, right? And that's where we get into negativity and negation. So talk to your neighbor or also use Mr. Google if you want to. What's the difference then between atypical and untypical, asocial, antisocial and unsocial, amoral and immoral? What is the difference there? They're obviously, I mean, we have two words, so chances are they don't have exactly the same meaning, right? We hardly ever have absolute synonyms, so what's the difference then? That it's, sorry, what was it? Yes, sort of. So, I mean, there are two differences here. Maybe it's a tricky one to start with, actually. Atypical means unusual, sort of. What is the context that immediately comes up if you hear atypical? Like, when would you use that, or who often uses it? You often find that in medical jargon. So you have an atypical blood type or an atypical behavior for a bacteria. So it's sort of, you have a very strict set of criteria, what is typical, and then you have an atypical strand, so it sort of creates its own type in a way. How about untypical? How often do you actually use untypical? Okay, I see shaking heads, exactly. We don't really use untypical, do we? But we do say, this is not untypical for this kind of students or something. So untypical usually is negated. The usage pattern we often get is not un. And we usually say double negation is difficult to process, but of course if this construction limits itself to this one use, then it becomes one thing and becomes easy to process again, right? And mostly when we really want to say not typical, we actually say not typical, right? Now how about asocial, antisocial, and unsocial? If I say I'm an asocial person, what does that mean? Perfect, yes. So if I'm asocial, this is mainly, I'm a bit of an introvert, maybe I don't particularly like socializing, but if I'm antisocial, then I'm going to actively do something that sort of disturbs the harmony of social life and civilization. And unsocial? I mean, I really mainly know it in one collocation. How can you call me at such an unsocial hour? Or how could this lecture start at such an unsocial time? Right? So early morning, early evening, when you usually don't socialize, so it's an unsocial hour. And how about amoral and immoral? Thank you for continuously volunteering here. Yeah. Exactly. Immoral is definitely closer to antisocial. So if you exhibit immoral behavior, this really goes against moral code. Whereas with amoral, we usually say, okay, this is a person who doesn't really have a set of morals. If it's an amoral, if he or she is an amoral person. So it's not that there are rules that I have and I'm breaking them, but I just don't have any rules, right? So we can see here already that A and an, while being very, and also E, of course, or in actually, while all of them sort of code negation, they don't really code precisely the same negation, right? And what we have here for immoral and illegitimate, inarticulate, and so on and so forth, that's all actually the prefix in. But depending on its environment, it assimilates to im and ill due to phonological conditioning, sort of. And what we have here also is, and that's where I said history also comes in, the in often attaches to Latinate nouns, and a comes from the Greek stems. So things like amorphous, apolitical, you can see, polis, that's a Greek word, but legitimare, that's Latin. So originally they came from different language backgrounds, they have different prefixes, but we have given them different meanings over time. They do not quite behave the same way. Now what about the difference between amoral, asocial, etc., and awake, alive, aside, and then again immoral, infertile, and then influx, induce, impose? What's going on here? I mean, obviously they sort of look the same, right? But they don't really fulfill the same function. What are the a and the ins in the lowest line? Let's try something. Which of them are gradable? So which of them can I make more intense than others? Like, I don't know, large, larger, largest, this kind of thing. Which one? So, not really, right? So something can be, I can be more inarticulate in the morning than in the evening, right? I can be more political than my sister, but I cannot be more awake than her. Or, okay, I mean, these are verbs, so they're not really ideal. So let's look at the S. And the reason, so what do we do with awake then? I mean, in theory, semantically speaking, I sort of can be more awake at some point in the morning than I like, so I can say, well, I'm awake-ish maybe, or I'm almost awake, so I sort of have to find a way around to that. And the reason for this is that the bottom bracket, they're actually, originally they were not prefixes in the sense that we understand them, but they were actually prepositions. Both of them meaning in, so in fact, or on. So in this state of wakefulness, sort of, I'm on it or in it. The same goes for live. There's this life I have and I'm on or in it. And that also even goes with away. I'm on the way, I'm not at home. So I'm away, and because they're prepositions, they don't behave the same way. And because these really were prepositional phrases, many things that you traditionally can do with adjectives, you cannot do with these. And this is where history comes in and plays tricks with us when we, for example, try to analyze, so what does the morpheme a mean? Well, it means different things. And that's what we mean by this variability of form and meaning. So if you want, you can read up on this a little bit. I put it on the slides, the difference between a as a preposition and as not and without, and then a little bit on in its different ways. Yes, and this brings us to today's main topic, word formation. We said we don't really do a lot with the closed class, so we'll be looking at open class words, open class categories for now. And I've brought you a couple of more or less new words that have entered the English language not too long ago. And again, I'd ask you to take a minute, chat to your neighbor, figure out how would you categorize them? How did they come into our language? What different ways do we find to make new words? I see some shaking heads. Maybe not all of them are indeed words, right? So I've grouped them for you then. I don't know if you know the first two. I know them from the US, that someone can be verklempt and someone can also be completely en fuego. What do those mean? What do I mean when I say, oh God, I was completely verklempt about the whole Brexit thing? Yeah, so it is not really the same as the German verklemmt, right? As in, I don't know, sexually hysteric or something, but verklemmt in a sense of emotional anxiety, angsty reaction to something. How about en fuego? You can say girls completely en fuego, but by now you can say, oh, this class is en fuego. I hope, maybe not. What does it mean? On fire, literally, and in a more metaphorical sense. Yeah, crazy, fun, really good, awesome. Yeah, but obviously they come from somewhere, so these are loan words. We borrow them from other language, usually, originally, traditionally through language contact, so obviously the US-Mexican border plays into that. The German, Austrian, and especially Yiddish migration to the US has coined quite a lot of new words. Nowadays, of course, with English-speaking TV series being streamed all over the world and the internet opening up a way of language contact that we never had before, this original way of contact isn't necessary. We have contact through other means, not necessarily geographically. How about, and those are of course a bit older, wicked and clue? What happened to wicked? That might be a bit more familiar. So what was wicked originally, or more or less originally? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Perfect, yes. So wicked, I mean, it comes from the whole witchcraft, magic, devil, demon set of words. And wicked was definitely bad. So wicked child was a really terrible one. But nowadays you can say, ooh, wicked, and mean really great, especially British, so I cannot do it properly. But anyways. And then there's clue, of course. In detective novels or in puzzles you get a clue, which in its original meaning was a ball of wool, which metaphorically you take through the labyrinth, through Minotaur's labyrinth, and sort of this ball of wool, this yarn ball, helps you find your way. So this is giving you a clue to find your way out of a puzzle or a difficult situation. And it has changed over the years, and this is just a semantic change, so something that originally meant something, and over time it became to me in something differently, usually through metaphoric extension, but not always. So this is what we've got for wicked and clue. Now about how about orc and Hoover? Okay, how about orc? Where do we know orc from? Yeah, orc and hobbit, and I'm sure there are many others. Well, house elf is difficult, but a Grindylow, all of these, somebody had something in mind that didn't have a word for, and so they made one up. And even there it's tricky, because we tend to use elements that already have meaning for us, like a house elf, for example, right? But sometimes we actually do really make up a completely new word like orc, and then it catches on, or it doesn't. This one did. How about to hoover, or a hoover? Who has ever used a hoover? Most of you, I guess. The vacuum cleaner, one of the especially US terms for vacuum cleaner, which originally was the name of the guy who invented it. And then this brand name caught on to mean the machine and now to also mean the action. So these are really sort of made up new words in a way. And sometimes we do that productively and they catch on. And sometimes they're so-called nonce words, meaning I make it up on the spot usually, and it has meaning for you and me in this conversation right now, but it doesn't extend beyond that. There's a famous test, for example, to look at how children acquire and use, not so much acquire, but how they use morphology. And that's the WOG test. So they got things like this. This is a WOG. Now there's another one. There are two of them. There are two, presumably WOGs, right? They could also take another kind of, I don't know, another allomorph of plural, but it's very likely that they would go for s, right? Now it would be interesting if this wasn't a WOG, but a woos. If they then formed two wooses, right? Because then we can see, they've learned the difference between the syllabic allomorph and the one after a non-voiced consonant. Not, of course, on this meta level, but in production. So that was the WOG test, and then they also had them do, form different verb forms and things like that. And this was a word that was made up for this experiment, and we haven't really encountered this creature outside of this experiment, so WOG hasn't really caught on. It has caught on, of course, in the sense of that linguists talk about the WOG test, but that's it. How about, what would have happened if the researchers had used frunch instead? Why is frunch a less likely candidate for English than WOG? It doesn't have any vowels, yes, and English needs vowels. Vuk works in Croatian, but it doesn't really work in English. So certain languages only have certain sets of vowel consonant combinations, certain syllables. Mandarin actually has a very limited set. I have an A4 piece of paper at home that contains all syllables in Mandarin, and that's it. You don't have any more. So some languages are more restrictive, some languages are more lenient, but there are certainly restrictions to that when it comes to what words we make up. Okay, and then the last group, where we have disapparate and leafty and yolkiness, which leafty and yolkiness only entered the Oxford English Dictionary this year, which I'm very excited about. I don't know what they did before leafty in the UK, but okay. So what is going on here? What's different between those? And the other ones? So here really have elements that the English language has, right? So despite the fact that Rowling made up this apparate, we have appear, we have apparate, and then she took the prefix this and stuck it to the front, thus creating a new word, which she made up, but it is made up of elements that we know. And there's a difference, of course, between leaf tea and disapparate and yokiness, which is what? The obvious one, yes. This is an easy lecture. You'll all do super well on the exam because that's not difficult. So what's the obvious one? Yeah. So in the first one we have two free morphemes that we put together to form a compound. And in yokiness we have affixation. So compound is going to be our next topic. We have loads of different compounds in English. This is an extremely productive thing. Even more so, of course, in German. Because in German I can basically stick any kind of relation to the next one and we create infinitely long words for which we're super famous. Especially when it comes to for language learners. And when we look at them like leaf tea, desktop, laser treatment, migraine treatment, they're different relationships between the elements. And while this is more a question of semantics, I'd just like you to briefly try that. I've given you some relationships. There are many, many, many more. Very interesting topic of research, very interesting research field. I'd like you to give a try to categorizing those up there. So which one are a question of two parts that specify locations, when is one an instrument for the other, and there are also a couple that don't go in this list. So give this a try to sort of put them into the different slots. And bear in mind there's not always one right answer. Sometimes there are more. Okay. So I would say an office window and a center aisle, those are mainly location ones because windows don't really change. It's not a different type. If it's an office window, it's just the one that's in the office, right? And the aisles, they don't change, but there's a center aisle. Whereas desktop, I'm talking about the top of a desk. Of course, that has changed again. We don't only talk about the desktop that I have here, but our desktop on a computer. Pencil tip, sort of the part of the pencil that I'm referring to. Then we have instruments, like the treatment where I use a laser as an instrument. It's a laser treatment. And that's different from a migraine treatment, right? I don't give you a migraine to treat something else, but I'm treating the migraine, hopefully. And then what kind of tea do I have? I have a leaf tea. What kind of formation do I have? Word formation. But then we can also look at blackboard, right? I mean, a blackboard in a way is originally a board that's black. But I'd also say that this is a blackboard, right? Despite the fact that it's very much not black. And interestingly enough, of course, we now have a whiteboard. The color is not what really determines the difference between a whiteboard and a blackboard, right? I can have a green whiteboard and a green blackboard. But there's the difference in how we write on it, one with chalk, one with marker, and this difference is represented by a color morpheme. Really weird, but very fun, I think. And then, of course, there's the greenhouse, which isn't very green, but we grow green things in it. So you can see how a bit of metaphor and meaning relationship goes on there. Yeah, and we already said that's very productive. Even English can form fairly long words. Supposedly, this is the longest English word, apart from some medical terminology, the anti-disestablishmentarianism, which originally meant, okay, I have the establishment and being religious, sort of religious, political, the connection between religion and politics. And if I have the disestablishmentarianism, those that move against it, then I have the entire movement, the disestablishmentarianism, and then I have the counter movement, the anti-disestablishmentarianism. And here you have in comparison the supposedly longest German word, der Rindfleisch-Etikettierungs-Überwachungsaufgabenübertragungsgesetz, which of course looks very scary to language learners, but when you analyze it morpheme by morpheme, it's fairly clear what it is. And with German we can do much more. I can say a door handle, a Türschnalle, but with Türschnalle I can do much more. I can say I have a Türschnallen-Lackpoliertuch, presumably, but I couldn't have a door handle varnish shine cloth. So English at some point stops and we would say, okay, this is the cloth that I used to shine the varnish off the door or something like that, right? Oh yeah, and these two, very interesting also. Which of the two is a blackbird? Yes, thank you. Both of them are blackbirds. The male blackbird actually is black. The female blackbird is brown. And there you can do your gender analysis of language, which one is the determining factor. Yeah, compounding in English, you already saw before that spelling is not a big deal. I mean, in German you usually make it all into one word and we don't have spaces in between. Whereas in English, you may have spaces, you may have hyphens, you may write it as one word. And usually the older the word is, the more likely it is that it's spelled together. And the later it was introduced into the language, then we usually have a hyphen or nothing in between an actual space. And the rule of thumb is usually look it up because you can't quite tell. Yeah. So you know you have different ones. And sometimes it's even a regional difference, like mousepad is usually spelled together, whereas the mouse mat in the UK, you usually have a space in between. What's very interesting though is stress. What's the difference between the English students and the English students? Yeah? Yeah. Exactly. And here, of course, I have a phrase, because I have an adjective plus a noun, and only this one really is a compound. And this already shows you that in English, the stress falls on the left bit that contributes meaning, and usually on the leftmost component. And you can immediately tell if I say a greenhouse and a greenhouse, a blackboard and a blackboard, a redneck and a redneck. You know what a redneck is? Yeah, okay. No? Then someone please explain. Yeah.
Where I'm from, it's the redneck comes from the work on the farms and some of the neck and the red, like farm workers, people who are working class southern U.S. mostly, they have pickup trucks and like
Perfect. So we've got the entire stereotype that goes with it really beautifully summed up. So southern US, usually working class, the idea being that you burn your neck in the fields originally, so it's very red. But there's a difference between a redneck, and if I say a redneck, that's the person. And then of course I have a walking stick and I have a walking stick. Or an ironing board and an ironing board, which would be very nice to have if we stop stressing the ironing, then the board would do the ironing itself, right? Because it's an ironing board. But it's tricky because we can have a stone wall, but we cannot really have a stone wall, right? We haven't formed a separate compound for the walls that are made of stone, but we can say to stone wall, right? What does that mean, to stone wall something? If there's sort of a proposition, if someone has an idea and someone else does everything to keep that from happening, to completely stonewall that proposal or that move or that change. So you sort of build up a stone wall and that becomes to stone wall. But we don't really have a stone wall. So not everything goes, which is, yeah, how language works and which is very nice about it. So very productive, this whole process, but not fully predictable, because you'd assume if I have a stone wall, and to stone wall, I also have a stone wall, but I don't. Yeah, now we'll quickly look at component parts. Obviously, not all compounds are nouns, and not all parts of compounds are really the parts that we have. So, for example, I can have a newspaper made up of a noun or a noun, but I can also have fast food, which obviously is adjective noun, or undertow, which is preposition noun. And they can also form other forms, with noun being usually most productive, so these are easiest to form, and verb. I mean, we do have them, like to crash land, that's to crash and to land, sort of, but those are rather rare. And there are some that we apparently don't have, so we don't really have any adjectives that are formed by combining a verb and an adjective. And we have very few, or, I mean, that's a matter also of what linguistic theory you use, or how you categorize whether or not you have prepositions that form adjectives with adjectives. So if I say oversensitive, it's not really the preposition over anymore, is it? It's more like an increase than over, in the sense of here's sensitivity and it's over that. But what we have to keep in mind is that we do that in a binary way, right? So we usually we combine wild and life before we stick the sanctuary on there. So we say it's a wildlife sanctuary and not a life sanctuary that's wild. And we also don't really have the three parts separately. And it's the right-hand element that always contributes the meaning. So a plant house is a kind of house, whereas a house plant is a kind of plant. Same with chairlift and lift chair, the skiing lift, or also the lift in the form of a chair, whereas a lift chair is a chair that I use for lifting in a hospital, for example. And how can we tell what is actually the head, what is the center element? Well, for one thing, the way we just did when we look at the actual meaning, but also by looking at where we add the inflection. So we don't say chairs lift to make the plural, we say chair lifts. Or windmills, windmill to windmills, not windsmill. However, sometimes something happens with loan words, like a cul-de-sac. Do you know what a cul-de-sac is? A street that has a dead end at the end, so you can drive in and out, but you cannot go through. And the plural of cul-de-sac is cols-de-sac. Now, why is that the case? Who speaks French? Which is obviously, I mean, this is a French loan word. Yeah? Yeah, that's the head in the French construction, right? And because in the French construction, this is the head, that's why this is where the inflection goes. But of course, many people, including myself until very recently, don't know that, so we tend to form cul-de-sacs. And if loads of people do it, then of course it becomes normal, and at some point, linguists say, okay, the hell with it, and standardize it. So cul-de-sacs by now is acceptable, but prescriptively it should be cul-de-sac, because that's where the original head, the original center was. So this right-hand member, that's what we call the determinant, because it determines what word class or what meaning we've got here. And this is what carries the inflection. Okay, I've skipped ahead here with the binary structure. So we combine wildlife. Okay. before we turn it into the wildlife sanctuary. That's fairly straightforward, right? But remember, this is what we call a binary structure. If it's got just two arms, that is binary. Yeah. So much for compounding. We'll now turn to affixation, and you can see what the rest of our program today is going to be. The conversions and the shortings. But first, affixation. So we talked about prefixes and suffixes. We talked about what the base is. I just want to remind you that the base is the thing I attach the affix to. It's not necessarily the smallest unit, right? So if I have my wildlife sanctuary, what's the base for sanctuary? Or actually, what's the, yeah, exactly, it should be the other way around. Sorry, it's a sanctuary, so the sanctuary is the base for wildlife. Not an ideal example, but you would know what I'm getting at, right? So it's the largest unit that's already there, to which I attach a little bit. That's my base. And prefixes, they rarely change word order, word class, as we said. Sometimes, of course, they do. Like which, and if I bewitch you, it becomes a verb. Or war, post-war, sort of becomes the adjective because it was the post-war, like a post-war theory or post-war apocalypse, whatever. But that is rare. Usually obey, disobey, happy, unhappy, they stay the same. And then sometimes very exceptional things happen, like above board. We have to do everything above board. How would you classify above board? What kind of word class is that? Okay, let's put it differently. What does it mean? How would you paraphrase above board? Yes. So how do we then have to do it if it's above board? Correctly, by the books, yes. So basically in this case an adverb, or we can also say sometimes we can use it as an adjective, but it's made up of a preposition and a noun. Which is sort of funny, but that's what we can do. So it's not straightforward like that, but usually prefixes don't change anything. Suffixes, now on the other hand, they tend to derive certain word classes. So usually we have a suffix like e, and I have the verb to employ, and if I stick e to it, I get a noun, employee. Now what happens with o, n, and y's? Try to draw up words, try to see what happens. What kind of word class do they turn into what other kind of word class? Give yourself a minute to do so. To what do I stick owl and what does it usually get me? All right. So if I stick O to fiction, tradition, culture, I turn nouns into adjectives, right? If I blacken something or widen or sicken someone, I have an adjective which I turn into a verb. And if I take length and clock and I add y's, I have a noun that suddenly becomes an adverb, right? So you can see here already that sometimes they're restrictive. Sometimes certain suffixes tend to, usually, some of them also always, attach to one base, one kind of base, and create a certain kind of derivative. They often have specific meaning changes that they bring about. So if I add let, then I usually get the diminutive, right, the small form, like in German with hen und lein. Which sometimes is nice. I have a story of a friend who learned Dutch, and because the Dutch case system, gender system is like the German one, so we have different ones where there's no rhyme and reason to it, because there's no reason why it's der Tisch, but die Lampe. So he said, well, if I just use the diminutive all the time, then I always know what case to use. So sort of like in German, if I say das Häuschen und das Mädchen und das Lämpchen, then I can always use neuter and get away with that, right? But it's not always very productive. In English, that wouldn't have worked. With German and Dutch, it does work. Now, S is also interesting because for some occupations and activities, we have this female form in English, but not for all of them. Whereas in German, we have the whole bin and e discussion because we have that for pretty much everything. Yeah, and I think you're familiar with all of them. Yeah. So something like we have also sometimes create different things, or both yun and n. There we sort of work with verbs, but if I turn the verb election into a noun, then I get this kind of action noun, whereas if I sharpen something, I make it sharp, so really the bit I have is the result and not the action. Yeah, different kind of suffixes. ER, of course, usually gives me the person who does it. But again, it's not always as straightforward. We also have things like a mixer and a toaster and a slicer, where that's not really the person who does it, but it's the instrument, the thing with which I do it. So there's not really always a straightforward relationship between them, right? The drawer is the thing that I draw out, and it's not necessarily someone who draws. And then I have fun ones, like, do you know what a cliffhanger is? Have Game of Thrones and stuff like that taught us all that? Yeah. What is a cliffhanger?
Well, like a certain scene which kind of makes you want to watch more, but then you get in the end, so you tune in next time.
Exactly, that's a cliffhanger. So the metaphor, of course, being that it's a kind of scene where you have this feeling of hanging on a cliff, almost dropping, this kind of suspense and tension, so you can't help to keep on watching, right? That's a cliffhanger. Or a nail biter. Sometimes books that have cliffhangers or movies that have cliffhangers are also nail biters. Yeah, exactly. It makes you so nervous, you bite your nails. Which is really interesting because like the book or the movie, it doesn't bite its nails. It's also not an instrument of nail biting. It just makes me do it. Yeah. So that's basically what I'm getting at here. One suffix can render a range of different meanings, but there are certain regularities, and this is really what linguistics is all about, trying to find the regularities, but also seeing, okay, this is where we have variation and what determines this variation. And we'll talk more about polysemy and semantics anyway, so you'll hear more about that. Yeah, you can also combine affixes. We've already seen that when we talked about base, so we don't only have logical, but we also have illogical, right? So we have logic, to which we attach O, which again forms the base for illogical, and so on and so forth. And we can also have both, right? We can have affixes, and then we form a compound, like aircraft, anti-aircraft missiles, with all kinds of derivation and inflection and compounding going on there. So it's not only one. So if you're ever asked to, in some place or time, determine what the word formation process is, keep in mind it might be more than one, right? Now, we briefly touched upon this. What happens with babysitter, or sword swallower, or tearjerker? These are tricky ones. Because, like, what do you think the word formation process for babysitter is? So what was there first, the verb to babysit or the noun babysitter? Yeah, the noun was there first. So it's not that we have to babysit and then we add the suffix that we talked about, the ER suffix making the person who, but really babysitter was there first, and then we, by analogy from other words, took away the ER ending and say, okay, well, if I'm a babysitter, then obviously what I do is to babysit. Sort of like the WOG experiments, just with adults and lots of that. So it's not always the kind of process you'd assume, but there's also something that we call back formation, which we'll get to. So just quickly in summary, prefixes, they usually don't change the word class. Suffixes do. Sometimes they only work with certain word classes. Sometimes they have certain meanings, but it's not that straightforward. So that was compounding and affixation. Now we come to this group. What happened with these guys? To book, to chair, to bag, to free, to clear, a play, a fight, a green, like the village green, a radical. What happened to these? Where did they come from? If I say book, what comes to mind first? A book, yes, exactly. If I say chair, we probably think of this thing, right? The verb is not activated as quickly, and that's because it comes from that. So we had the nouns first, and then we got the verb, and this is what we call zero derivation, because we did derive a new word, but we can't see it. There's no visible morpheme that did that. So it's like conversion, like currency change. We converted it into something else, but we don't see the difference. There's no overt marking of that. And they're also very productive in English, mainly because we don't have endings. Like we talked about hablar, ir, tener. These endings are in English, in German, gehen, können, singen. There's something that marks, hey, I'm a verb. And English doesn't have that. Therefore, we can take many things and just say, okay, let's make it into a verb. Let's say I'm chairing a meeting and I'm booking a train. But it also works into nouns, for nouns. So to play, and then I have a play, or the adjective free, but I can also free the prisoners. This is what we call conversion or zero derivation. And then we have these bunch. So, oh well, you've got one marked. In these beautiful dialogues that I've created for you, you have 11 new words, sort of. You have 11 words that were created there, or not necessarily there, but that came about at some point, and I'd like you to look for them. One is already in bold and underlined, so that should help you. Sorry. So what words strike you that came about by word formation processes that we haven't discovered yet? So not compounding, not affixation, and not conversion. Which words strike you? Yes? Smog, yes. Yes, indeed. Very good. Anything else? Yeah? Beautiful, yes. ASAP or ASAP. Anything else? Yeah? Sorry? NASA and CIA, yes. Perfect. What else? Yeah. Beautiful, yes. Exam is short for examination. Any others that are shorter than the originals? Yeah. Yes, the vet here, the veterinarian, yeah. Yes, flu is short for influenza. Sometimes we get that. In old writing, you get an asterisk before flu to sort of indicate that it's a short form for influenza. Yeah, any others? Yeah? Fridge, yes. Short for refrigerator, indeed. And then nobody dares mention this one? Relicious, yeah. Does anyone know what relicious is? Okay, almost. Yeah, but really delicious, I would still agree. So we've got a bunch here. I think we've mentioned them all, apart from Rob, which was already marked. So let's group them then. We have these 11 words, and I tell you there are 4 categories of all these words that are shorter than their originals. That's why we call them shortenings. So let's, I'm giving it all away. I need to reformat these. So edit goes down here. All the others, edit we actually didn't mention. We'll talk about that in a second. But all the others try to put them into these 3 groups, and one group has 2 subgroups. So try to categorize them. What's the difference between all those shorter forms? Again, talk to your neighbor. It's usually more fun that way. Or don't if you're asocial. All right. I've grouped them like this. I would say exam, rob, vet, and fridge, and flu are fairly similar in a way because they're all clippings. So I've clipped away a bit from Robert, from veterinarian, from examination, refrigerator, and influenza. And you can already see you can clip front and back, right? What we usually have left is the stressed syllable. Not always, but almost always. Then we have blends, like we already heard, smoke and fog give us smog. And if something is reheatable and then delicious, like lasagna, it becomes relicious. And we have abbreviations, and watch out for this. We tend to use abbreviations for all things that are briefer. Only these are called abbreviations. Okay, I'm saying it again. Only the things where I have initial letters, these are what we call abbreviations. And we have 2 different types. So, what's the difference between CIA and NASA? Yeah. Perfect. Yes. So, if I say the initial as its own letter and then another one like an initial and another one like initial, like J.R.R. Tolkien. So all these initials, that's how you sort of read it. Like CIA, then it's an initialism. Whereas NASA, we call an acronym because we say the whole thing and that's what it's called. And edit now is a back formation, like to babysit. Editor was there first, and in a similar kind of analogy, we had editor and we said, well, if I'm editor, then obviously what I do is I edit. And that is called back formation. Those are our 4 types of shortening. The clippings, where we have no change in meaning, we just clip away a bit. We usually keep the stressed syllable. And if we do that to names or proper nouns in general, then we call it a truncation. The idea being we only keep the trunk. And all of these are clippings. The blends, we blend 2 things, and usually part of each base is deleted, but sometimes only part of one. So with a docudrama, I have the whole drama, but the documentary I've taken out a bit of, right? And the abbreviations formed from the initial letters or sounds. And we have the two, the ones that are pronounced as one word, the acronyms, and the ones that are pronounced letter by letter, so-called initialisms. Now, some abbreviations do not retain these capital letters or the full stops in between that we sometimes have. Like laser and radar and ASAP, which I still learned as ASAP, but which nowadays can also be said as ASAP. And I don't know if you're still familiar with yuppie, because it's such an old word, but more recent is the dinky. A person who's in a couple where both have an income and they don't have a kid, so they usually are able to afford more things. They're dinkies, the double income, no kids people. And with laser, I mean a light wave amplification by stimulated emission of radiation, you sort of see why they had to make it shorter. And it lends itself to being an acronym because it has all these vowels. The fewer vowels, the harder it is to make an acronym out of it, right? Now, what is this? What kind of word formation process? Yeah, thank you. Some things are an acronym and an initialism, because I do say the initial letter T in TTIP, but then this I sort of put into one word, so this would be an acronym and an initialism. As we said, we can have more than one process at work. We can also have the T-tippers and the anti-T-tipper campaign, which also becomes one word, so you have compounding, you have affixation, you can have all in one. Keep that in mind. And once more about back formation, something that looks like a suffix is deleted, and then we then change the class of word, like with edit, and the most famous example, of course, being the hamburger, which was a Hamburg steak in a bun, coming from the city Hamburg, so a hamburger, which was reanalyzed, because if I can have a hamburger, which coincidentally is a word in English, then of course I also have a chicken burger and a fish burger and a cheeseburger and whatever else. But originally the word burger didn't exist. All this came into the English language through back formation. All right? So just to give you a brief overview, so for the shortenings, we can have one-word things, then there are clippings or back formations, or more than one-word things, then there are blends, or they turn into abbreviations, where we can have acronyms if we say the whole word, and initialism if we just say the initials. Yeah, and their linguistic meaning that we can see is usually deleted rather than added. So not like with affixations and compounds, where we put more things there, we delete certain things. This is our list of word formation processes. Any questions about any of these? We're good? Okay, just one more thing. So in terms of productivity, meaning how often do we do that? How easy is it to do that? Compounds are very high, so we get that often and easily. Shortenings don't come up that often, and conversion and derivation are somewhere in between. Now, in the interest of edutainment, which is what kind of word formation process? What is edutainment? A blend, yes, between education and entertainment. I've given you a link to a video, 11 Terms Invented by How I Met Your Mother. Okay, wait, yeah. You'll see a couple of them in the video, and at home I encourage you to watch the video and try to analyze the different words, and you'll have the solutions on the final slide. Okay? So I'll just briefly say reading for next time. You know how that works. Read Blog et al. For more on word formation, and for semantics, which Christiane Dolten-Puffer is teaching next time. You'll look at semantics, so this chapter in Yule, please. Thank you very much. See you in a couple of weeks' time.